My name is Leona, and I'm 62 years old. For the past 3 months, I've been sharing my home with my daughter's family, thinking it would bring us closer together. I spent that entire afternoon preparing what I thought would be a perfect family dinner, seasoning the roast just the way my late husband used to love it. The dining room smelled like home, like love, like everything good about family gatherings. But I never imagined that the meal I had poured my heart into would become the battlefield where I'd finally learn to stand up for myself. The plate of food I had so carefully prepared ended up scattered across my kitchen floor, and the words that followed changed everything between us forever. Before I share what happened that night, let me know where you're watching from in the comments below. If you've ever felt disrespected in your own home, hit that like button. So I know I'm not alone in this. Don't forget to subscribe, because this story has a twist you won't see coming. Now let me take you back to the evening when everything changed. I became a widow 3 years ago when my husband Robert lost his battle with cancer. We had built our life together in this 2-story house in the suburbs of Denver, Colorado, where we raised our 2 children and watched them grow into adults. For 35 years, I taught 3rd grade at Maple Elementary, pouring my love into hundreds of children who called me Mrs. Patterson. This house had always been filled with laughter, the scent of fresh-baked cookies, and the warmth of family gatherings around our dining room table. My daughter Sarah, now 34, had grown into a compassionate woman who worked as a nurse at Denver General Hospital. She married Derek 6 years ago, and they blessed me with 2 beautiful grandchildren. Emma, my 8-year-old granddaughter, has her father's sharp mind, but her mother's gentle heart. Little Jake, only 5, still believes in magic and runs to me every time he scrapes a knee or needs a story before bedtime. Derek seemed like a decent man when Sarah first brought him home. He worked as a software engineer, always polite during family dinners, and he made my daughter smile in ways I hadn't seen since her college years. He would compliment my cooking help, clear the table, and even fixed my leaky faucet without being asked. For years I thought Sarah had found herself a good man, someone who would treat her and my grandchildren with the respect they deserved. Everything started changing 6 months ago when Derek received a promotion to senior developer at his tech company. Suddenly, his salary jumped to $150,000 a year, and with that financial success came a transformation I never saw coming. The man who once appreciated my homemade apple cinnamon pie began making snide remarks about it being too sweet and old-fashioned. He started questioning my cooking methods, suggesting I should learn to make more modern cuisine instead of the traditional family recipes I had perfected over decades. Last week, when I offered him a slice of my famous apple cinnamon pie, the same recipe that had won blue ribbons at the county fair for 5 consecutive years, Derek looked at it with disgust and said it looked dated and unsophistizing. The hurt in my chest was immediate, but I swallowed it down, telling myself he was probably just stressed from work. I had spent my entire adult life nurturing others, and the idea that my efforts were being dismissed so casually left me feeling smaller than I had felt since Robert's funeral. 3 months ago, Derek and Sarah approached me with what they called a temporary living arrangement. They wanted to move back into my house to save money for a down payment on their dream home. Derek had calculated that if they could live rent-free for just a few months, they could save enough to afford the perfect house in the newer subdivision across town. As a mother and grandmother, I welcomed them with open arms, excited about the daily presence of my grandchildren and the opportunity to be more involved in their lives. We sat at my kitchen table to discuss the arrangement over coffee and my homemade blueberry muffins. Derek had everything calculated on his laptop, showing me spreadsheets and projections. They promised to contribute $800 monthly to cover the increased grocery bills, utilities, and general household expenses. I would help with childcare after school and during Sarah's evening shifts at the hospital, and in return, they would respect my home and help maintain it. It seemed like a perfect arrangement that would benefit everyone involved. But reality proved much different than their carefully planned projections. Derek contributed exactly $200 during their first month, claiming unexpected car repairs had drained their savings account. When I gently reminded him of our agreement, he waved me off, saying I was being nickel and diming him when he was family. Meanwhile, my monthly grocery bill had tripled my water, and electricity costs had doubled, and suddenly my quiet house was filled with Derek's loud conference calls and late-night gaming sessions with his friends. Derek began treating my home like his personal kingdom, rather than the sanctuary I had maintained for decades. He would leave his dirty dishes in the sink for days, expecting me to clean them. He cranked up the air conditioning in summer and the heat in winter without any consideration for the utility bills I was paying alone. When I asked him to use coasters on my antique coffee table, he laughed and called me uptight about furniture that was probably worthless anyway. The breaking point came during what I now call the Great Menu Controversy. Derek approached me one evening while I was planning the weekly meals, demanding I stop cooking what he called old people food. He wanted me to eliminate meatloaf pot roast tuna casserole and every other comfort food that had been staples in my kitchen for 40 years. Instead, he handed me a list of modern meals he had found on some fitness blog requiring expensive ingredients I had never heard of and cooking techniques I had never learned. When I tried to explain that I had been cooking these recipes since before he was born, Derek rolled his eyes and told me I needed to evolve with the times instead of being stuck in the past. My daughter Sarah sat quietly during this entire exchange, occasionally murmuring agreement with her husband about trying healthier options. I felt like a stranger in my own kitchen, watching my family traditions being dismissed as outdated and irrelevant. Last Tuesday evening, Derek decided to invite 6 of his work friends over to watch the Monday night football game without asking my permission or even giving me advance notice. I came home from my weekly grocery shopping to find strange cars in my driveway and loud voices coming from my living room. Derek had transformed my tidy family room into what looked like a sports bar with beer bottles covering my coffee table and potato chip crumbs ground into my carpet. His friends were sprawled across my furniture, shouting at the television and making crude jokes that made me uncomfortable in my own home. When I quietly suggested they might want to keep the noise down because the children were trying to sleep upstairs, one of Derek's friends actually laughed and asked if I was the house mother. Derek joined in the laughter, introducing me as Sarah's mother, who lives with us now. The emphasis he put on those words made it clear he wanted his friends to see me as the dependent one in this arrangement. The party lasted until 11:30 that night, long after my usual bedtime, and well past the time when normal neighbors would consider it respectful to quiet down. When they finally left my living room, looked like a tornado had hit it. Beer had been spilled on my carpet, leaving dark stains that I spent an hour trying to clean with carpet cleaner and cold water. Food had been ground into the cushions of my sofa, and someone had used my good cloth napkins as disposable wiping rags. When I approached Derek the next morning about the mess and the lack of courtesy in not asking permission to use my home for his party, his response floored me completely. He looked me straight in the eye and said, "This is my house now too, and I have every right to entertain my friends here. Maybe you should have gone to bed earlier if the noise bothered you." The dismissive way he spoke to me as if I were a child being scolded rather than the homeowner who had opened her doors to his family left me speechless with hurt and anger. 4 days ago, the situation escalated to a level I never thought possible. My granddaughter Emma had been struggling with her math homework, and I was sitting with her at the dining room table, patiently explaining long division the way I had taught thousands of students over my career. Emma was getting frustrated, and I was using gentle encouragement and praise to help her work through the problem step by step. Derek stormed into the dining room, took one look at Emma's tear-streaked face and began yelling at her for being lazy and stupid. His voice was harsh and angry, the kind of tone that makes children shut down completely rather than learn anything constructive. When I gently placed my hand on his arm and suggested we take a calmer approach, Derek whirled around and told me to mind my own business. His exact words were, "Don't interfere with how I parent my child. You're too old to understand modern educational methods, and your outdated ways are probably why she's struggling in the first place." The impact on my grandchildren became impossible to ignore. Emma and Jake started spending more time hiding in my bedroom, whispering questions about why Daddy was always angry and whether they had done something wrong. Jake began having nightmares and crawling into bed with me in the middle of the night, something that broke my heart because I could feel his little body trembling with anxiety. These children who had always run to me with scraped knees and happy stories were now seeking me out as a refuge from the tension their father was creating in what should have been their safe space. Sarah, my once confident daughter, had begun avoiding eye contact with me and agreeing with everything Derek said, even when his opinions contradicted values she had held her entire life. During one particularly difficult evening, I tried to talk to her privately about the changes I was seeing in the family dynamic. She looked exhausted and defeated as she told me that Derek had convinced her I was trying to undermine their marriage and turn the children against him. I realized with growing horror that my son-in-law was systematically isolating my daughter from me, making her believe that the problems in our household were my fault rather than his disrespectful behavior. That night, I made a decision that would change everything. I was going to prepare one final perfect family dinner, the kind that had always brought my family together in the past. I would cook all of Derek's favorite foods from when he first started dating Sarah, recreate the warm atmosphere that had once made him compliment my hospitality, and somehow find a way to remind him of the man he used to be, before success had changed him into someone I no longer recognized. I woke up that Thursday morning with renewed determination and a plan to save my family. I decided to prepare what Robert and I used to call our Thanksgiving dinner in miniature, featuring all the traditional foods that had made our family gatherings special for decades. I pulled out my mother's handwritten recipe cards, yellowed with age and stained with years of love, and planned a meal that would remind everyone what home was supposed to feel like. I started with a 12-pound turkey that I had been saving in my freezer, thawing it overnight, and seasoning it with the herb blend that had been passed down through 3 generations of women in my family. The preparation was a meditation for me, each step connecting me to my mother and grandmother. Women who had used food as their love language long before that phrase became popular. I made my famous sage and onion stuffing from scratch hand-cutting day-old bread into perfect cubes and sautéing celery and onions until they were translucent and fragrant. My mashed potatoes were made the way Robert had always requested them, with real butter-heavy cream, and just a touch of roasted garlic that made them impossibly smooth and rich. I prepared green bean casserole with fresh beans rather than canned ones, topping it with crispy fried onions that I made myself instead of using the store-bought version. The cranberry sauce was my grandmother's recipe, tart and sweet, with just a hint of orange zest that made it bright and festive. I spent extra time setting the dining room table with my best china, the set Robert and I had received as a wedding gift 40 years ago, and only used for the most special occasions. I polished each piece until it gleamed, arranged my good cloth napkins in perfect triangles beside each plate, and lit the candles that I had been saving for a special moment. The dining room looked like a magazine photograph, warm and inviting, and filled with the kind of love that transforms a house into a home. As the afternoon progressed and the aromas filled every corner of the house, I felt hopeful for the first time in months. Emma and Jake kept wandering into the kitchen, drawn by the smells, and excited by the obvious care I was putting into this meal. Emma asked if we were celebrating something special, and I told her we were celebrating being a family. Jake helped me arrange the dinner rolls in a basket, his little hands careful and proud as he placed each one just so. Sarah came home from her shift at the hospital, looking tired, but pleased to see the effort I had put into dinner. For just a moment, I saw a glimmer of the appreciation she used to show for my cooking, and I allowed myself to believe that this meal might be the turning point our family needed. She helped me carry the serving dishes to the dining room, commenting on how beautiful everything looked and how much she had missed these kinds of family dinners. At exactly 6 o'clock, I called everyone to the table. The turkey was golden brown and perfect, carved into neat slices that lay fanned across my best serving platter. The side dishes were arranged around it like colorful jewels, each one representing hours of careful preparation and decades of refined technique. The candles cast a warm glow over everything, and for just a moment, my dining room felt like the heart of a happy home again. Derek came to the table last after finishing what he claimed was an important phone call, but what I suspected was just a way to demonstrate that his time was more valuable than our family meal. He sat down with an expression I couldn't quite read, scanning the table, with eyes that seemed to be looking for something to criticize rather than appreciate. The children were chattering excitedly about their day at school, and Sarah was serving them appropriate portions while commenting on how wonderful everything smelled. For the first 10 minutes, everything proceeded normally. Emma told us about her art project, Jake described the game he had played at recess, and Sarah shared a funny story from the hospital. I felt my heart beginning to relax as I watched my family gathered around the table, believing that perhaps my fears had been overblown, and that Derek's recent behavior had just been a temporary phase brought on by work stress. But then Derek picked up his fork, took one bite of the turkey, and his expression changed completely. He chewed slowly, deliberately, with a look of disgust spreading across his face. He set down his fork with an exaggerated motion and stared at his plate as if I had served him something inedible. The conversation around the table began to die away as everyone noticed his obvious displeasure. "This food," he said loudly enough for everyone to hear, "looks like something you'd feed to livestock. Who eats this kind of heavy old-fashioned slop anymore?" His voice carried a tone of contempt that made my stomach drop, and the children's eyes go wide with confusion. Sarah started to say something, but Derek cut her off with a dismissive wave of his hand. I tried to maintain my composure, explaining gently that these were traditional family recipes that had been passed down through generations, meals that had brought comfort and joy to our family for decades. I mentioned that his own mother had complimented these same dishes during their engagement party, and that these recipes held special meaning because they connected us to our family history and traditions. Derek's response was swift and cruel. He looked directly at me and said, "No wonder Sarah's gained weight since we moved in here. This is slop, pure and simple. Heavy, greasy, old-fashioned slop that nobody with any taste would put on their table." His words hit me like a physical blow, not just because of their cruelty, but because of the way they dismissed everything I had tried to do to bring our family together. That's when he did the unthinkable. Derek reached across the table, grabbed my carefully prepared plate, and with deliberate malice swept it off the table onto the floor. The crash of my good china breaking against the hardwood was like a gunshot in the sudden silence that followed. Pieces of turkey, mashed potatoes, and green bean casserole scattered across the floor, mixing with the shards of my grandmother's plate, in a mess that looked like the destruction of everything I held dear. Then came the words that I will never forget as long as I live. Derek looked down at the mess he had created, then looked back at me with a smile that was pure cruelty and said, "If you want dinner, lick it off the floor like the old dog you are." The silence that followed was deafening. Sarah's face went white with shock, her hand covering her mouth as if she couldn't believe what she had just witnessed. Emma began crying, not understanding what was happening, but sensing that something terrible had just occurred. Little Jake's eyes filled with tears, as he looked back and forth between his father and me, confused and frightened by the sudden violence and cruelty in what should have been a safe space. I sat there for what felt like an eternity, but was probably only 30 seconds staring down at the ruins of my meal scattered across the floor. My good china broken into pieces that could never be repaired. The humiliation was complete and devastating, made worse by the fact that it had happened in front of my grandchildren, who would now forever associate family dinners with fear and cruelty rather than love and comfort. In that moment of complete humiliation, something shifted inside me. Instead of the crushing shame and hurt I expected to feel, a strange calm descended over my entire being. It was as if the broken plate on my floor had somehow broken through to a strength I had forgotten. I possessed a backbone that had been built through years of standing in front of classrooms full of difficult children and decades of facing life's challenges alongside my late husband. I stood up from my chair slowly, methodically, with none of the shakiness or uncertainty that Derek probably expected to see. I didn't cry, I didn't shout, I didn't beg for an apology, or try to explain why his behavior was unacceptable. Instead, I reached for my napkin, wiped my hands with deliberate care, and adjusted my cardigan with the same composure I had used when dealing with the most challenging students in my classroom. The entire dining room watched in absolute silence as I performed these simple actions. Derek's smug smile began to fade as he realized that I wasn't reacting the way he had anticipated. Sarah stopped crying and stared at me with wide eyes, as if seeing a side of her mother she had never witnessed before. Even the children stopped their sniffling and watched with the instinctive awareness that something important was happening. I looked directly into Derek's eyes, my voice calm and steady, and spoke 3 words that would change everything. "You're done here." There was no anger in my voice, no hysteria, no pleading. The words came out with the quiet authority of someone who had finally reached the end of their tolerance and was prepared to take action. It was the same tone I had used with disruptive students who had pushed past every boundary and needed to be removed from my classroom, the voice of someone who had made a decision and would not be swayed by arguments or manipulation. Derek's reaction was exactly what I expected from a bully who had been challenged for the first time. He threw back his head and laughed a harsh sound that echoed in the silent dining room. "Are you threatening me, Leona? What exactly are you going to do? This is my home now too, in case you forgot. Sarah and I have legal rights here, and you can't just kick us out because you're having a temper tantrum over some spilled food." But I had already turned away from the table, walking past the mess on my floor, without looking down, leaving my family sitting in the ruins of what should have been a celebration of our bond. I climbed the stairs to my bedroom with the same measured pace I had used to leave my classroom on my final day of teaching, knowing that a chapter of my life was ending, and that I was ready for whatever came next. In my bedroom, I sat at the small writing desk Robert had given me for our 20th anniversary, and pulled out a legal pad and my favorite pen. I began making a list, writing down names and phone numbers of people I would need to contact, resources I would need to gather, and actions I would need to take. For the first time in months, I felt completely clear-headed and purposeful, as if the humiliation in my dining room had burned away all my uncertainty and revealed the strength that had always been there underneath. The first name I wrote down was Benjamin Walsh, the attorney who had helped Robert and me write our wills and had handled the legal paperwork when Robert died. The second was Patricia Morrison, whom I had met at a school fundraiser and who worked in human resources at Derek's company. The third was my neighbour Margaret, whose son worked for a private investigation service and who had once mentioned that workplace harassment was taken very seriously by most major employers. As I wrote, I could hear Derek downstairs, his voice getting louder and more agitated as he realized that I had not returned to clean up the mess he had created, or to apologize for challenging his authority. I heard Sarah's voice quiet and uncertain, asking him to help clean up the broken dishes. I heard him refuse, saying that it was my mess to clean up, and that maybe next time I would think twice before serving garbage to my family. But I was no longer listening to Derek's voice with the hurt and confusion that had characterized the past 3 months. Instead, I was planning strategizing and preparing to take back control of my home and my life. The scared, uncertain woman who had been trying to keep peace at any cost was gone, replaced by someone who understood that respect is not something you beg for, but something you demand and enforce. By the time I went to sleep that night, I had filled 3 pages with detailed plans and had already composed the emails I would send first thing in the morning. Derek could laugh at my 3 words all he wanted, but by the end of the next day, he would understand exactly what "you're done here" meant when spoken by a woman who had finally decided to stop tolerating the intolerable. The next morning, Derek left for work at his usual time, still smirking, and confident that our dinner table confrontation had been nothing more than an empty threat from a frustrated old woman. He kissed Sarah goodbye with exaggerated affection, loud enough for me to hear from the kitchen, and told her he would be working late because important people were depending on him to finish a critical project. The condescension in his voice made it clear he considered himself the most significant person in our household. At exactly 9 o'clock, I walked into Benjamin Walsh's law office, carrying a folder filled with documentation I had been gathering for weeks without realizing it. Bank statements showing the disparity between Derek's promised contributions and actual payments, utility bills demonstrating the increased costs of supporting his family, and photographs I had taken of the damage to my furniture and carpet from his party. Benjamin reviewed everything carefully, his experienced eyes taking in details I hadn't even realized were legally significant. "Leona," he said, setting down the papers and looking at me seriously, "this house is entirely in your name, inherited from Robert, with no joint ownership or tenant agreements with your daughter and son-in-law. You have every legal right to terminate their residency with 30 days written notice, regardless of their financial situation or family relationship to you. Moreover, some of Derek's behavior constitutes what we might call domestic intimidation, which gives you grounds for expedited removal if necessary." Benjamin also revealed something that stopped me cold. During our conversation, he mentioned that Derek had recently applied for a substantial personal loan using my address as his residence and my property as collateral reference, all without my knowledge or consent. He had been caught when the bank called to verify property ownership, and Benjamin had been contacted as the attorney of record for my estate. Derek had been attempting to essentially steal from me while living under my roof and eating my food. At 11 o'clock, I sat in the corporate offices of Derek's company, facing Patricia Morrison across a polished conference table. Patricia was a no-nonsense woman in her 50s who took her job seriously and had built a reputation for handling workplace issues with fairness but firmness. I had requested this meeting by explaining that I had information about potential policy violations by one of her employees that reflected poorly on the company's professional standards. I opened my laptop, which my granddaughter Emma had helped me learn to use more effectively, and showed Patricia the emails Derek had been sending from his company account. Over the past 2 months, he had written dozens of messages to co-workers complaining about his crazy old bat mother-in-law, describing me as a senile widow who was too stupid to understand modern life, and joking about how he was stuck living with a relic from the past. Patricia's expression grew more serious with each email she read. "Mr. Patterson," she said, "these messages represent multiple violations of our company's harassment and discrimination policies. Using company resources to disparage elderly individuals, even family members, creates a hostile work environment and reflects poorly on our corporate values. Additionally, the language used here suggests ageist attitudes that could extend to how he treats older clients or colleagues." But the most damning evidence was an email Derek had sent just last week, describing in crude detail how he planned to break down the old woman's resistance and take over her house completely by making my life so miserable that I would eventually sign over property rights or move into a nursing home. He had written this during company time, using company equipment, and had sent it to his supervisor as if it were a musing workplace conversation. At 2 o'clock that afternoon, I called Sarah at the hospital during her lunch break. My daughter answered the phone with the tired voice of someone who had been dreading this conversation, but knew it was inevitable. I spoke to her with the same calm clarity I had used with Derek the night before, but this time my words carried love and concern rather than finality and determination. "Sarah," I said, "I need you to know about some things Derek has been doing that you're not aware of." I told her about the attempted loan fraud, about the emails describing his plans to manipulate me into giving up my home, about the credit card debt he had been hiding from her while claiming they needed to save money. I read her some of the most hurtful phrases from his work emails, not to cause her pain, but to help her understand that the man she had married was not who she thought he was. The silence on the other end of the phone lasted so long that I thought we had been disconnected. When Sarah finally spoke, her voice was small and broken. "Mom, I had no idea. He told me you were being difficult about the house rules, and that you resented having us there. He said you were trying to turn me against him, and that I needed to choose between loyalty to my husband and enabling your controlling behavior." As Sarah began to cry, I realized that Derek had been systematically isolating her from me, using the same manipulation tactics that domestic abuse experts always warned about. He had been reframing every reasonable boundary I set as evidence of my hostility toward their marriage, every attempt I made to maintain my own home as proof that I wanted to break up their family. Sarah had been living in a constant state of emotional manipulation without recognizing it. By 4 o'clock, I had changed the locks on my house and packed Derek's belongings into suitcases and boxes that I arranged neatly on my front porch. I did this not out of anger or spite, but with the same methodical efficiency I had used to organize my classroom supplies at the end of each school year. Everything was folded properly sorted by type and placed in appropriate containers that protected his possessions while making it clear that they no longer belonged in my home. When Derek arrived home at 5:30, he discovered that his house key no longer worked. I watched from my living room window as he stood on my front porch, staring at his belongings in growing disbelief and rage. He rang the doorbell repeatedly, then began pounding on my front door, shouting my name and demanding that I let him in immediately. His voice carried the anger of someone who had never been held accountable for his actions and couldn't believe that consequences had finally arrived. I opened the door just wide enough to speak to him through the chain lock I had installed that afternoon, my voice carrying the same calm authority I had used the night before. "Derek, you have 24 hours to arrange for permanent housing for yourself. Your wife and children are welcome to remain here as long as necessary, but you are not. Your employer will be contacting you tomorrow morning about some policy violations they need to discuss with you." The panic that crossed Derek's face was immediate and unmistakable. He began calling Sarah's cell phone frantically, but she was not answering because she was already in my kitchen, sitting at my table with a cup of tea, asking me to help her understand how her marriage had gotten so far off track without her noticing. The man who had thought he was conquering my household had discovered that his own world was crumbling faster than he could call for help. The consequences for Derek unfolded with a speed that surprised even me. On Friday morning, Patricia Morrison called him into her office for what the company termed a disciplinary review meeting. By Friday afternoon, Derek was terminated from his position for violations of the company's anti-harassment and discrimination policies, misuse of company resources, and conduct that reflected poorly on the organization's commitment to treating all individuals with dignity and respect. Sarah filed for divorce the following Monday after spending the weekend reviewing bank statements and credit card bills that revealed the extent of Derek's financial deception. The man who had convinced her they needed to live in my house to save money had actually accumulated $45,000 in secret debt through online gambling and expensive purchases he had been hiding from her. Sarah's attorney explained that Derek's financial irresponsibility and documented pattern of manipulation gave her strong grounds for full custody of the children. But the most satisfying consequence was watching Derek's transformation from an arrogant bully into a desperate man who finally understood that actions have results. When he returned to collect his belongings, gone was the smirking confidence and casual cruelty. Instead, he stood in my driveway, looking smaller somehow, defeated by the reality that his victim had turned out to be much stronger and more resourceful than he had ever imagined possible. Sarah and my grandchildren remained in my home for 6 more months while she rebuilt her financial independence and found a suitable apartment for their new life as a single-parent family. During this time, our relationship healed in ways that went deeper than it had ever been before. Sarah began asking me about my experiences as a working mother, about how I had maintained my sense of self while supporting a family, and about the strength I had found to stand up for myself when it mattered most. The children flourished once the constant tension and unpredictability left our household. Emma's grades improved dramatically once she no longer had to worry about walking on eggshells around her father's volatile moods. Jake stopped having nightmares and returned to being the cheerful, curious little boy he had always been. Both children began cooking with me again, learning family recipes and hearing stories about their grandfather that Derek had never allowed me to share. As the months passed, I discovered that setting firm boundaries had not made me a harder or less loving person. Instead, it had freed me to be more genuinely myself than I had been in years. I started volunteering at the local literacy center, using my teaching skills to help adults learn to read. I joined a book club at the library, making new friendships with women who shared my love of literature and thoughtful conversation. I began traveling again, something Robert and I had always planned to do more of in retirement, but had put off because of his illness, and then my grief. I visited my sister in Oregon, took a train trip through the Rocky Mountains, and even flew to Washington, D.C. to see the Smithsonian museums I had always wanted to visit. Each trip reminded me that my life was far from over, and that I had years of experiences and adventures still ahead of me. The most important lesson I learned was that respect is not something you earn through endless sacrifice and accommodation. Respect is something you teach others to give you by demonstrating that you value yourself enough to require it. For too many years, I had confused keeping the peace with being loving, but I discovered that sometimes the most loving thing you can do is refuse to enable someone else's harmful behavior. My relationship with Sarah became stronger than it had ever been built on honesty and mutual respect, rather than the obligation and guilt that had characterized too many of our interactions when Derek was manipulating both of us. She began coming to me for advice about parenting decisions, career choices, and life planning, treating me as the experienced and wise woman I had always been, rather than the burden Derek had tried to convince her I was. 9 months after that terrible dinner, I received an unexpected phone call from Derek. His voice was different, humbled and uncertain, in ways I had never heard before. He asked if we could meet for coffee because he wanted to apologize and try to make amends for his behavior. I agreed to see him not because I was interested in reconciliation, but because I was curious about what he had learned from the consequences of his actions. During that conversation, Derek admitted that losing his job, his marriage, and his children had forced him to examine behavior patterns he had never acknowledged before. He had started therapy and was working on what his counselor called entitlement issues and emotional abuse patterns that he was only beginning to understand. He didn't ask for forgiveness or try to minimize what he had done, but simply acknowledged the harm he had caused and expressed genuine remorse for his actions. I accepted his apology because forgiveness was something I needed to do for my own peace of mind, but I also made it clear that acceptance did not mean restoration of relationship or trust. Some bridges once burned cannot be rebuilt, and some lessons can only be learned through permanent consequences. Derek would always be the father of my grandchildren, but he would never again be welcome in my home or my life. Today, as I sit in my beautifully maintained home surrounded by the photographs and memories of a life well lived, I feel a sense of peace and strength that I never imagined possible during those dark months of being bullied and dismissed in my own space. My dining room table reset with new china to replace what was broken hosts' family dinners that are filled with laughter and genuine affection rather than tension and walking on eggshells. Sometimes I think about that moment when I stood up from my chair and spoke those 3 simple words that changed everything. "You're done here" represented more than just evicting a difficult houseguest. Those words marked the moment when I reclaimed my own power, when I stopped accepting unacceptable behavior, and when I chose to value myself enough to demand the respect I deserved. The most profound realization I've had is that standing up for yourself doesn't make you a difficult person or a troublemaker. It makes you someone who understands their own worth and refuses to let others diminish it. The woman who spent months trying to keep peace at any cost learned that some peace isn't worth keeping if it requires you to sacrifice your dignity and self-respect. I share this story not for sympathy or revenge, but because I believe there are other people out there who are tolerating intolerable situations because they are afraid of conflict or worried about what others will think. Sometimes the kindest thing you can do for yourself and others is to set clear boundaries and enforce them consistently even when it's uncomfortable or difficult. 3 words can indeed change your life, but only if you're prepared to back them up with action. "You're done here" was just the beginning of a journey that led me back to myself, back to my strength, and back to a life where I'm treated with the respect every person deserves. And that transformation, difficult as it was, has been worth every moment of uncertainty and every ounce of courage it required. The greatest gift we can give ourselves is the knowledge that we deserve to be treated well, and the strength to accept nothing less. Sometimes that means having difficult conversations, making hard choices, and standing firm when others test our boundaries. But the peace that comes from living authentically, surrounded by people who value and respect you, is worth every challenge you might face along the way. Has someone in your life ever pushed you past your breaking point, and how did you find the courage to stand up for yourself? Share your story in the comments below, because your experience might inspire someone else who's struggling with a difficult situation. If this story resonated with you, please hit that like button and subscribe for more real-life stories about finding strength in unexpected moments. Don't forget to share this video with someone who might need to hear that they deserve better treatment than they're currently accepting. Thank you for listening to my story. And remember that it's never too late to reclaim your power and demand the respect you've always deserved. Until next time, stay strong and know your worth.